Good morning. Gosh, I see faces here that I haven't seen for a while, so that's wonderful. Usually when I ask if there's any birthdays at this service, nobody ever has a birthday. I think you were all just sort of like just landed on the planet, or you've just always been here. So, but at the risk of the fact that we may have missed somebody's birthday, if you had a birthday last week or today or next week, if you would stand, we would love to honor you. Nope, still no birthdays. Okay, you guys are good. You guys are good. You're consistent, you know. Second service, they were all born, you know. I mean, they have birthdays all the time and stand up and we sing to them and stuff like that. So, how many of you saw today's talk title and said, "What the heck is that?" Several people, yeah. Me too, by the way. When I first saw it, it's like, what the heck? This comes from the home office. And that thin slicing is the name of today's talk. And thin slicing refers to the ability of our unconscious to find patterns in situations and behaviors based on very narrow slices of experience or information. Okay? So it's pretty much, I get a little piece of information, a little thin slice of information, a little thin slice of my experience with someone, and I make a judgment or an observation or base my behavior on that. Excuse me one second there. And we're looking this month at, this whole year we're looking at our values, living our values. What are our values? And this month we're looking at the values of diversity and inclusivity. And for some of us, that's, our perceptions get in the way of that, and we'll talk about that. So what this is based on, this idea of thin slicing is based on, and when I first saw this, I said, you know, to the home office, I said, what the heck? And they said, the book for the month is Blink. It's a book called Blink. And it's a whole book about this process. So if you want to go and learn more about it, this book called Blink by, I believe it's Maxwell, yeah. Malcolm Gladwell, yes, thank you, is the author of that. It's a good book. It's an interesting book on how we perceive things. And it's that our unconscious plays a huge part in how we perceive the world. And if we're clear, we perceive the world clearly, and we can get it just like that. We can get it just that quickly. How many of you have had an intuitive flash that is actually accurate, and all of a sudden you go and you perceive something, even though there's no logic to support it, right? Many of us have had that. Most of us have had that experience. So with that, if we're clear, we can perceive the truth, and truth that otherwise isn't known by other means. We don't have the time to process it. We don't have all the data in place. We just know it, okay? And he talks about, for the opening of the story of the Getty Museum in the Los Angeles area, had just bought or was considering buying a very expensive Greek statue, ancient Greek statue, something called a kouros. And they're fairly rare, and full ones, complete ones, are extremely rare. And an art dealer was offering them a complete one for a very large price of money. And if it was valid or legitimate, it would have been worth a pretty large amount of money, but they didn't want to get taken in. So they had their experts check it. And they had them check out the lineage, and the lineage was, of course, a little muddy back there in the European, you know, somewhere in there, somebody stole it from somebody else, and you know, and like that. But they had them check it out. They even took a little biopsy, if you will, of it. They took a little piece of the statuary out and analyzed it, and it all came back right. And everything informationally said, this is legit, this is genuine. And so around that point in time, they had a visiting art expert who was an expert in this, who walked in and he said, he took one look at the statue, and the first word that popped into his mind was fresh. Now, fresh, if you're looking at vegetables, is a good thing. If you're looking at bread, it's a good thing. If you're looking at an ancient Greek statue, not so good, okay? Along the lines, they had a couple of other people, along the way, they had a couple of other people come in. One guy said he experienced almost a little nausea right away when he first looked at it. He didn't figure out why, but just something in his body just felt off. And so eventually they researched it some more and found out truly it was a fake. You know, somebody started noticing that, well, the head is from this era and this region of Greece, but the feet are more from this era and this region of Greece. And when they started putting it all together, they realized it was a complete fake, extremely well done, extremely well made, and it was a fake. And I think they'd already bought it by that point in time, too. These people knew what to look for, what they were looking at. They had this visceral reaction, and they knew right away that it wasn't right, and they couldn't explain it. It was just literally a first look at it, boom, bang. That very first word almost that pops in the mind. Now, if we're not clear, what happens is we bring in our past conditioning. And we don't see the truth so much as we see our own belief system being reflected back to us. Okay, our own belief system. A man gets a new hunting dog. And he decides to take the dog out for a hunt, to check him out and like that. So they go duck hunting, and he goes and shoots a duck. The duck falls down into the lake, and the dog goes running out across the top of the water, grabs the duck, and brings it back. The man's going like, that's unusual. So he shoots another duck. The dog goes running out across the top of the water, grabs the duck, brings it back. So he says, this is amazing. So he goes home, calls up his hunting buddy, and says, we got to go hunting tomorrow. You got to see my new hunting dog and what it can do. So the next day they go hunting, they shoot a bunch of ducks, and the dog always goes running out across the top of the water, grabs the duck, brings it back. And the guy finally looks at his friend and he says, you notice anything unusual about my dog? And he says, yeah, your dog doesn't know how to swim. We have our own perceptions of how it should be, and when they don't, and when they don't correspond, we simply impose our belief system. Ernest Holmes says that race suggestion, when we talk about race mind or race consciousness, it's the human race. It's the tribal consciousness, the group think, if you will, okay? So he says that race consciousness is a very real thing, and each individual carries around with him and has written into his mentality many impressions which he never consciously thought of or experienced. Many perceptions that we never consciously thought of or experienced are in our subconscious mind. When we realize that the individual's subjectivity is his use of the one subjective mind. So there's only one mind, okay? And we're all using it. And the subjective mind, we're all using the one subjective mind, so we are tapped into all the collective experience of the human race. It's all living within us. We have access to all that. It says, when we realize that the individual's subjectivity is our use of the one subjective mind, we shall see that a subjective unity is maintained between all people, and that individual mentalities, individual minds, who are in sympathetic vibration with each other, more or less mingle and receive suggestions from each other. This is the meaning of mental influence, which is indeed a very real thing. This is why, when we're young, or when our kids are young, we talk about the company you keep. Because you tend to mingle with and vibrate with people at your level. And if you want to change your level, you hang out with people mingling at a different level. Okay? Why do all the drug dealers in town live in more or less the same kinds of areas instead of scattered? Okay? Why? So we have all sorts of people who have the same belief system hanging out in the same area. We have all sorts of people thinking the same belief system that are working together to correspond and to hold that belief system in place. So we want to look through that. Being able to perceive is like looking at a car window, and you can either see the reflection coming off the car window, or you can look through the reflection and see what's inside the car. You can't do both at the same time. You have to shift your perception. And so when we're looking at our belief system, when we're not clear, we're looking at the reflection coming off the window. When we're clear, we look past the reflection and see what's actually behind the reflection, what's actually inside the window. There's something called an IAT, an implicit association test, which identifies where we carry unconscious biases. And one of the ways the test looks like is they'll have a list of, the simple version of it, the start-off version, the warm-up version of it, is you have a list of people's names, just first names. And one column is male, one column is female, and you just put a check mark by which one you would associate with that. And they're, pretty simple. And then it gets more complex. You have a list of people's names and other words, and you have male, career, female, family, okay? And so you go down the list and you check off which one goes in which column. And most people can do that one pretty quickly. What's interesting is what happens when you switch male and family and put that together, and you have female and career and put that together, people's minds slow down. It takes longer to process because most of us are associated with male and career being more or less the same thing, and female and family being more or less the same thing. We have a subjective belief system that most of us were raised with for that. And so in order to change that association, it takes a few milliseconds more, and so it's slower. It's even more interesting when they have race, when they have white and black, good and bad, okay? And most people will, including black people, will usually associate much quicker with white and good. And when you flip that around, black and good, or African American and good, and Caucasian and bad, and again, it takes longer to process that. It takes us a while to switch our brains from that. Okay? We're going to talk about a way to improve that in a minute. But we have all these beliefs about race, about gender, about everything. One of the things he points out in this is our beliefs about height, how tall people are. He says that of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, first of all, the overwhelming majority are white male, right? We kind of all pretty much know that. Okay? But interestingly enough, 58% of them are 6 foot tall or taller. The general population of men is only 14.5% of all men are 6 foot tall or taller. And even more interestingly, of those, 33% are 6'2" or taller, and only 3.9% of the general population of men are 6'2" or taller. So we have this association with, if you're tall, you're a great leader. You look like a leader. The classic example of this, by the way, was Warren G. Harding. He was elected president basically, and senator, basically because he looked like a leader. He was tall, he was rugged, he had this overpowering, shock of first black, then silver hair, big dark eyebrows. He had a voice, and people loved him, and they elected him, and they thought he was vibrant and healthy, and he died pretty early in office of a heart attack, and he was generally considered one of the worst presidents in the United States. This was before the last two, so I'm just going to take those two out of the equation, okay? Whatever way you want to lean on that, okay? But he's generally considered one of the worst presidents of the United States, but he looked dang good. He looked presidential. He looked senatorial. They said he was actually absent during the votes on prohibition and women's suffrage, two of the most important issues of the day. He wasn't even on the floor to make a vote. Okay, that's how not caring he was, or incompetent. So we have these ideas. They're very deep, they're very subjective. And can we start to get past those ideas? So we have an idea of what certain people in certain roles should look like. We all have an idea of what mother looks like, right? We do. We have some ideas, some generalizations, generalized ideas, okay? And mom usually isn't 6'2", volleyball queen, sort of person. We don't associate that with mom. There's other things we associate with mom. We associate things with dad. We associate things with minister. We associate things with all sorts of different roles. You don't see a whole lot of 5'2" police officers, do you? Especially when you see a woman police officer, we kind of go, ooh, wait, recompute, okay? So most of the time, we are unaware of why. We don't even know why we believe that, because it's so locked behind the door of our unconscious mind. That's why asking people why they believe this isn't very revealing. I remember reading in a church book years ago, church consulting book years ago, that when people leave a church and exit a church, don't give them exit interviews. Don't ask them why they're not coming back, because most of the time they don't really know the reason why. They'll tell you something, but they don't know why. There was a test done on taste testing jams. This was by a focus group that was trying to taste test different jams. And they had a bunch of food experts who got together and agreed on, out of 42 jams, which ones were the best to the worst. And if you want to know, Knott's Berry Farm was considered the best jam by this particular group. Then they went and took about 6 of those, kind of spread throughout there, gave them to a bunch of college students, and said pick the best jams. And the college students all pretty much picked the same things. There's a little slight shift in order, but pretty much all agreed on the same things. That this one over here was the best, this one over here was the worst. And then they asked them why. Now the food experts have a language. They can tell you, they are aware of why they are judging something as good, okay? Because they have that language, they're expert at it, okay? The college kids didn't have that language. And they logicked themselves into completely different orders of things to where Knott's Berry Farm actually ended up as being the worst jam when they started analyzing and thinking about why, okay? We all have, if we taste jam, okay, we all have an unconscious right away reaction, either this is good or this is bad, right? Okay? But when we start to think about why, we start to confuse ourselves. Years ago, I was in a board retreat. We had a little 4-person board in the church that I was going to. And there was a person who was facilitating the retreat who was giving a test for a problem to solve. And we were given a bunch of cards divided up among the 4 of us, and he told us that all the information you need to solve this problem is on these cards. Okay? And so I immediately took a look and said at all this, and I said, well, the best thing we can do is, let's put all of our cards into a pile in the middle and start to go through them. And 3 of us did that, and the minister said, no, I'm going to try and figure this out on my own. By the way, if I had realized at that moment what that meant, I would have walked out of that board right then. I did later on, as did everybody else on the board. But a highly controlling personality. Anyways, she was going to figure it out on her own. And so the 3 of us started working with just the information we had. We had about 3/4 of the information, in other words, to solve this problem. And about 10 minutes in, I had this intuitive hit of the answer for the problem. And I think if I remember right, there was like 4 choices we had, and I had this intuitive hit, it's this one. And I said that, and the other 2 people who were with me said, we don't quite necessarily see that, but we get that you really get it. We're with you. And the minister all of a sudden goes, I don't understand, you have to explain it to me. And we have to work this out. And so we went back and worked it and worked it and worked it. And we had 25 minutes to do this test, and at 24 minutes and 55 seconds, we finally came up with a completely different answer. Afterwards, the person who was facilitating the retreat pulled me aside and he said, you had the answer at 10 minutes. He says, that was the fastest I've ever seen this exercise ever done. Anybody ever solve it? Intuitively, you hit right on it. He said, I was actually going to call it. He said, I actually was had the words right at the edge of my mouth when the minister said, no, stop, I don't understand this. And then you guys logicked yourself into the wrong answer. Okay? We started to analyze why. What was the logic? So can we pay attention to our intuition? Or do we get so much information that we are paralyzed by it? There's another story that they tell in the book about a war game that was played in 2002 by what's known as JEFCOM, Joint Forces Command. And they had started planning this game in about 2000. So they spent 2 years and literally billions of dollars for this war game. As they said, it was more than some country's entire defense budget alone, just for this war game. And so so this is 2000 to 2002, just to give you the time frame. And the war game was about a rogue dictator in the Middle East with a large religiously based following that would do anything for him, starting an uprising, and the United States had to come in and put this down. Sound familiar? Okay. And so they brought in for the bad guy, this guy who had been a rather maverick commander during the Vietnam War. Okay? And he was known for being way outside the box and for being a very spontaneous boom, boom, boom person. And they brought him to be the reactionary leader. So they prepared for all this for a couple of years. They launched the attack, and the first thing that the United States did in this war game was to knock out the fiber optics and all the communication channels and figured, okay, good, they'll have to use cell phones and satellites, and we can monitor that. And the guy said, the heck with that, and he started sending motorcycle messengers. This is all happening in games. Motorcycle messengers, bicycle messengers, and messages in prayer books out to his troops to command them, okay, to do that. So he was bypassing the how do we monitor it system. And then he assassinated the leaders of the U.S.-friendly countries around him, and also sent out a bunch of really small boats to the U.S. fleet out there, and he knew how many missiles they could handle and launched more missiles that they can handle at the fleet. And basically, within a couple of hours, as they said, 16 of the vessels and 20,000 people were on the bottom of the Persian Gulf. Again, war game, nobody got hurt, okay? Because he went outside the box, and they were meanwhile sitting there going, we've got all this information, we know how it should go, and this is how it should look, and we've got it all figured out. And he says, I've got a whole different book that I'm playing with. And I'm going on basic gut instinct and thinking fast on the spot. Can we do that? There are times when it's fabulous and wonderful to have all the information, and sometimes we get analysis paralysis, where we have so much information that we're stuck and we can't move. So what does all this mean in my life, your life, right now? First of all, It's a good reason to learn the feel of your intuition. What does my intuition feel like? One of the questions I oftentimes get as a minister is, what's the difference between my intuition, that inner voice within me, and my ego voice? And how do I tell the difference between the two? And so one of the ways to do that is practice. It's just practice. One of my favorite ways to do that is what's called visioning, but it's anything that we can do to start to tap into my intuition. What does that feel like? What does that sound like? What does that look like for me? What's my experience with it? And that intuition is different than my biases or prejudices. And so it takes that practice, it takes that development to play with that. The second thing we can do is to start to change our perceptions. I mentioned about the IAT race test. One of the students of this guy who wrote the book was talking about that he had a friend who, this student was taking the test every single day because he wanted to try and blow through his prejudices, and he wanted to try and get better at it. And he said one day, despite all the times he had practiced, hadn't made much improvement, one morning he aced the test, and he realized that right before the test, he'd been watching the Olympics. He'd been watching a whole bunch of African-American athletes do really wonderful things. And he said he was in a different mindset when he took the test. And so one of the things that the author suggests is looking at people, filling ourselves with the speeches of Martin Luther King, the speeches of Nelson Mandela. Start to look at people who are of the race or the gender or the whatever we have biases against, and see people who are doing wonderful things in that, and it starts to shift our perception. Hang out with different people, in other words. Recondition our programming. Recondition that subjectivity in our mind. To start to have a more expanded idea of who these people are, who we are, and to be more inclusive, and to be not put off by diversity. And so to start to hang out with that consciousness. See, my comfort zone is what I know now. What I know now is my comfort zone, and I feel very comfortable in that. If I'm going to learn anything new, guess what? I have to get uncomfortable. If I want to learn to play the piano, which I don't know how to do right now, I would have to get uncomfortable. I would mess up Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star at the start of it. Okay? You know, you can tune a piano, but you can't tune a fish. I just had to. I'm sorry, I just had to. We have to get into the unfamiliar territory to expand. Are we willing to become a little bit uncomfortable? Are we willing to move into new territory to start to express ourselves? So this week, what I want to invite us to do for a spiritual practice is two things. Number one, pay attention to how you perceive. I was just talking with somebody yesterday who talked about that in Science Mind 101, the 100 series classes. There was an exercise where you monitored your self-talk. You wrote down your self-talk and what it is that you perceive. So pay attention. What am I perceiving? As I'm looking at whatever the situation is, what's my first impression? What's my first impression? What's my first impression? Is it intuitive, or is it based on old beliefs and old prejudices? What's happening? Begin to trust my intuition. Begin to notice, I'm having this word flow through my mind, or this feeling in my body, or this sound in my ears. Okay? Am I always looking for more information? I mean addictively always looking. I can't make a decision without more information. Okay? You've met people like that, right? Okay? I know none of you are, but you've met people like that. Am I always addictively looking for more information? Do I get caught up in analysis paralysis? Do I often misperceive? Do I oftentimes think something is one way and then later on find, no, it's not like that at all? It's completely different than that? And here's the other part of that. Am I open to being wrong? Even the people who are intuitive, really good at intuition can sometimes be wrong. Am I okay with being wrong sometimes? And learning from that mistake. So that's the first part of the spiritual practice, is observing, how do I perceive? How do I perceive? Just monitoring it, just paying attention. And then the second thing is to practice developing our intuition. As I mentioned, visioning, the process of sitting and going, what is Spirit's highest idea about this situation, about my life, about this circumstance? What is Spirit's highest idea? And starting to listen within to that still small voice within, so I start to hear what that's like. More than even just knowing what is the answer to that question, it's, can I exercise that muscle and start to listen and feel, and experience. What does intuition feel like? What does it sound like? How does it work within me? And so I start to do that. Getting centered in the heart, taking a moment to be still, just centering. This morning, right before we were getting ready to start off, we were kind of all going, are we ready to go? And Marilyn, who's always calling us to center, just said, let's take a moment to get centered. It was just like, let's leave what I was doing before behind. Let's leave what I think is going to happen afterwards behind, and let's just get centered. One of my favorite phrases is just become a being sitting in a chair breathing. Nothing else to do. So we start to listen to that intuition. What does that feel like when all the chatter starts to fall away? And then start to become very aware of our first impressions. So would you like to play with me this week on that? We're going to observe our perceptions, and we're going to learn what our intuition feels like a little bit more. Practice and develop that muscle. Are we good with that? Okay. I want to close with a quote from the book. It says, we can take time each day to check in with ourselves, to review our own thoughts and thinking patterns for the day for our own personal evaluation. Taking a daily inventory of our mental atmosphere leads to a higher expression of consciousness. And I like that idea of mental atmosphere. What is my mental atmosphere? Am I walking around scared? Am I walking around worried? Am I walking around sad? Am I walking around in joy? Am I walking around in trust? What's my mental atmosphere for the day? Taking a daily inventory of our mental atmosphere leads to a higher expression of consciousness. Once we become aware of our thoughts and patterns of thinking, especially those not planted by us consciously, which do not serve us or humankind, we can replace them with higher vibrational thoughts, thoughts that lead to the expression of our spiritual magnificence, vibrancy, and wholeness. I invite you this week to become aware of, where have I been stuck in looking at the reflection, and how can I look through the window and see what's truly going on? Let's move into prayer. So taking a moment to just become centered. I know, and we all know, there is only one presence, one infinite, whatever we call it. The field of infinite possibility, the quantum field, spirit, God, Allah, Tao, whatever name we give it, there is only this one unifying presence. And each of us, because that is all there is, have to be one of it right here, right now. We are tapped into a universal mind. And so I speak my word that this week each of us clears our lenses a little bit more, becomes more aware of truly perceiving spirit, of spirit perceiving spirit as, by, and through us. That we drop our preconceived notions, that we are not looking in our rearview mirror of the past, but we are seeing in the present moment, clearly. And that just this seeing allows us to then be present with a person, to be present with a situation, to be present with ourselves, clearly. And so for each of us who says yes to this process, yes to this practice, yes to this possibility, I'm so grateful for the clarity that comes through each of us and for the genuine spirit-perceiving spirit with love, with joy, with wholeness that each of us experiences. I'm ever so grateful. And so I release this word into a law that moves it into form and expression in our lives right here and now, knowing it does so, and so it is. Thank you.